Sometimes the water that once carried your dreams becomes the mirror that reflects your deepest shame. The Riverside Municipal Pool sat like a forgotten cathedral in Baltimore's crumbling East Side, its chlorinated air thick with decades of broken promises. Michael Phelps pushed his mop across the tile floor, each stroke echoing through the empty facility where champions once trained and children once laughed. 20 years ago, everyone knew his name. Now he was invisible, just another ghost haunting the lanes where he'd once ruled. The three officers appeared in the locker room doorway like shadows given form, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. Detective Morrison spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of ultimatums. Tomorrow's race, Phelps. You're going to lose it. They knew about Phoenix, about the rainy night in 2004 when everything changed, about the family he'd left broken on a dark highway while fleeing his own shattered dreams. But as their threats filled the humid air, something stirred in the water behind them, ripples that shouldn't exist in a pool that had been still for hours. The conspiracy they represented went deeper than dirty money, and the race they wanted him to throw was never about swimming at all. What happens when the man who once conquered water must face the depths of his own buried truth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Michael's hands tightened around the mop handle as the impossible ripples spread across the pool's surface. The water hadn't moved in 3 hours. He'd checked the filtration system himself, run through his nightly routine with the mechanical precision of a man who'd spent 2 decades avoiding the very element that once defined him. Detective Morrison stepped closer, his leather shoes squeaking against the damp tile. "You hearing us, janitor?" The word dripped with contempt, designed to strip away any remnant of the legend Michael had once been. Or do we need to spell it out in smaller words? The other 2 officers flanked Morrison like practiced predators. Officer Kane, young and eager with hungry eyes, drummed his fingers against his service weapon. The third man, whose nameplate read Torres, leaned against the lockers with the casual menace of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "I heard you," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. Even 20 years later, he could feel the phantom sensation of water filling his lungs, the panic that had consumed him that night in Phoenix when everything unraveled. "But I'm not racing tomorrow. Haven't raced in—" Bullshit. Kane's interruption cut through the humid air. Half the neighborhood's talking about it. The great Michael Phelps, coming out of retirement for one last charity swim to save this dump. Michael's jaw clenched. The community center's director, Mrs. Chen, had been desperate when she'd approached him last week. Riverside was hemorrhaging money, the city threatening closure. The charity race was a Hail Mary, a chance to generate enough donations and publicity to keep the doors open for the kids who needed it most. He'd agreed in a moment of weakness, thinking maybe he could help without actually getting in the water himself. Be a figurehead, sign autographs, let someone else do the swimming. But the story had gotten twisted in the telling. Now everyone expected Michael Phelps to swim again. "I'm not swimming," he repeated, though the words felt hollow even to him. "I just agreed to help with the event." Torres laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Right, and I'm sure the betting lines in Atlantic City know you're just there to hold towels." He pushed off from the lockers, moving with predatory grace. "See, Mike? Can I call you Mike? We've got a problem. My associates and I, we placed some substantial wagers on tomorrow's outcome. Very substantial, the kind that buy boats and second homes." "You bet against me?" Michael couldn't hide his disbelief. Even washed up, even terrified of the water that had once been his domain, some part of him bristled at the assumption of defeat. "We bet against nostalgia," Morrison clarified. "Against some has been thinking he can recapture past glory. The smart money says you'll belly flop in the first 50 meters if you even make it to the starting blocks." But Michael heard what they weren't saying. If they'd come here, taken this risk, it meant they were scared. Scared enough to threaten him directly instead of simply counting their winnings. The pool's filtration system hummed in the silence, but those impossible ripples continued spreading across the surface. Michael forced himself not to look at the water, focusing instead on the 3 badges before him. Each one represented the law he'd spent 20 years trying not to break again, the system he'd hidden from since that rainy night when he'd made the worst decision of his life. "What makes you think I won't just call this in?" he asked, though they all knew the answer. Men like him didn't call police on police. Men like him kept their heads down and their secrets buried. Kane's smile was sharp as a blade. "Because we know about Phoenix, Mike. September 15th, 2004, rainy night, dark highway, broken family." He pulled out his phone, swiped through photos. Margaret Chen, 8 years old. David Chen, 5, same last name as your boss here, funny coincidence. Their parents were driving, home from David's swim lesson when a blue Honda Civic ran a red light and disappeared into the night. The mop handle slipped from Michael's suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the tile. Mrs. Chen, the woman who'd believed in him enough to ask for his help, the woman whose grandchildren had died because he'd been running from his own failures, desperate to escape the swimming scandal that had already destroyed his career. "She doesn't know," Torres said conversationally. 20 years she's been waiting for answers, for justice, and here you are, the man who killed her family, working right under her nose. Poetic, really. The weight of 2 decades crashed down on Michael's shoulders. Every kindness Mrs. Chen had shown him, every gentle conversation, every moment she'd trusted him with the keys to this place. All of it built on a lie so monstrous he could barely breathe around it. Behind the 3 officers, the pool's surface had gone mirror-still again, reflecting the fluorescent lights like accusations. But Michael could swear he heard something else now, beneath the mechanical hum of the building, the faint sound of children laughing, ghosts of all the lives this place had touched, all the lives he'd destroyed and might yet destroy. The race was tomorrow, and for the first time in 20 years, Michael Phelps had no choice but to swim. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the building's mechanical breathing and the distant hum of Baltimore traffic filtering through frosted windows. Michael stared at the 3 badges gleaming under fluorescent light, each one a reminder of how far he'd fallen from the man who once stood on podiums while national anthems played. "So what's it going to be, Mike?" Morrison's voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who'd perfected intimidation over years of practice. "You throw the race tomorrow, finish dead last like the washed-up has-been you are, and everyone goes home happy. Mrs. Chen never learns the truth about her precious janitor." Michael's throat felt lined with sandpaper. 20 years of carefully constructed normalcy, the same route to work each morning, the same bologna sandwich at lunch, the same methodical cleaning routine that kept him busy until the small hours when sleep finally claimed him. 20 years of voluntary exile from the world that had once worshipped him, and it all balanced on the edge of these 3 men's greed. "I need time to think," he managed. Kane snorted. "Time to think about what? You're going to lose anyway. We're just asking you to make it convincing." But Torres held up a hand, studying Michael with calculating eyes. "He's not thinking about the race, are you, Mike? You're thinking about all those mornings when Mrs. Chen brings you coffee. Black, 2 sugars, just the way her late husband used to drink it. She told you that story, didn't she, about how she started this job to honor his memory, to give back to the community that supported her through the grief?" The cruelty was surgical in its precision. Michael had indeed cherished those morning conversations, the only human connection he'd allowed himself in years. Mrs. Chen would arrive early, always with an extra cup from the diner down the street, and they'd stand in the lobby discussing the weather, the neighborhood kids, the small kindnesses that made life bearable. She'd never pressed him about his past, never questioned why a man with his credentials was content mopping floors and scrubbing toilets. "She sees something in you," Torres continued. "Probably reminds her of the son she lost. David would be 25 now, wouldn't he? Maybe married, maybe giving her grandchildren to spoil." His smile was a predator's grin. "Instead, she's got you, the man who stole all of that from her." Michael's hands clenched at his sides, the phantom sensation of steering wheel leather against his palms, the squeal of brakes on wet asphalt, the sickening crunch of metal and glass. It all came rushing back with vivid brutality. He'd told himself for 20 years that he was protecting Mrs. Chen by staying silent, that knowing the truth would only compound her suffering. But standing here now, he recognized the lie for what it was, cowardice wrapped in noble intentions. "The race starts at 10, Morrison said. checking his watch with theatrical precision. Registration opens at 8. That gives you roughly 12 hours to decide whether you want to keep your comfortable little life or watch it burn to ash. He gestured around the empty pool area. And this place? Your beloved community center? It'll close anyway once the scandal breaks. No amount of charity money can save a facility run by the woman who unknowingly employed her own children's killer. The three officers moved toward the exit with the coordinated precision of men accustomed to leaving wreckage in their wake. But Torres paused at the door, his reflection caught in the security mirror mounted above the entrance. One more thing, Mike. Don't get any heroic ideas about confessing or running. We've got 20 years of surveillance on you. Security footage, credit card records, witness statements. You so much as twitch wrong, and it all goes public. Mrs. Chen deserves to hear the truth from us, don't you think? Nice and gentle, surrounded by her friends and co-workers who'll get to watch her world collapse in real time. The door's pneumatic hiss marked their departure, leaving Michael alone with the echo of his own ragged breathing. The pool's surface had returned to mirror stillness, but he couldn't bring himself to look at it directly. Even now, the thought of submersing himself in that chlorinated embrace triggered the familiar spike of panic, the sensation of drowning in his own failure. He bent to retrieve the fallen mop, his hands trembling slightly as muscle memory guided him through the familiar motions of wringing and swirling. This routine had anchored him for 2 decades, the methodical progression from poolside to locker room to lobby, each task a small victory against the chaos that threatened to consume him. But tonight the ritual felt hollow, a mockery of the man he'd once been and the man he'd never become. Tomorrow morning, Mrs. Chen would arrive with coffee and her gentle smile, trusting him with another day's responsibility for the place that meant everything to her. She would have no idea that her faith was misplaced, that the quiet janitor she'd grown to depend on was the architect of her deepest sorrow. The race was tomorrow, and Michael Phelps finally understood that some choices could never be undone. Michael stood motionless in the echoing silence, the mop dripping chlorinated water onto tiles he'd cleaned thousands of times before. The building felt different now, no longer a sanctuary but a crime scene where his past and present had finally collided with devastating force. Every shadow seemed to harbor accusations, every reflection in the pool's surface a reminder of the lies he'd built his existence upon. The emergency exit door in the far corner caught his attention, its red emergency lighting casting an ominous glow across the wall. He'd walked past that door every night for 20 years without giving it a second thought. Now it seemed to pulse with possibility. Escape, flight, the chance to disappear into another carefully constructed identity in another forgotten corner of America. He could be in Delaware by dawn, Pennsylvania by noon. Start over again, find another pool, another night shift, another Mrs. Chen who didn't know that kindness could be so catastrophically misplaced. But even as the thought formed, Michael felt the familiar weight of invisible shackles around his ankles. He'd tried running once before, fleeing Phoenix in that blue Honda Civic with the shattered headlight and crumpled bumper. The guilt had followed him across 3 states in 2 decades, growing heavier with each passing year instead of lighter. Running again wouldn't free him. It would only add Mrs. Chen to the list of people he'd abandoned when they needed him most. The institutional clock above the lifeguard station ticked toward 1:47 a.m., each second bringing tomorrow's reckoning closer. In 8 hours, early morning swimmers would begin arriving for their laps, transforming this sterile space into something alive with purpose and community. Mrs. Chen would unlock her office, brew the first pot of coffee, and begin the delicate choreography of event coordination that had consumed her for weeks. The charity race represented months of planning, countless phone calls, and the kind of desperate hope that only came from watching something precious slowly die. Michael forced himself to look at the pool directly for the first time since the officer's departure. The water lay perfectly still, a rectangle of artificial blue that had once been his domain, his temple, his path to immortality. Now it was just 8 lanes of chlorinated terror, each one a reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he was still too cowardice to face. The diving blocks at the far end seemed to mock him with their patient readiness, waiting for a swimmer who no longer existed. His phone buzzed against his hip, a jarring intrusion that sent his heart hammering against his ribs. Michael pulled it out with trembling fingers, expecting to see Morrison's number or some new threat from his tormentors. Instead, the screen displayed a text from Marcus Johnson, his only real friend from the old days, the one person who'd maintained contact through the wilderness years. Saw the news about tomorrow. Proud of you for getting back in there, champ. Margaret and David would be smiling. Michael's knees buckled. Marcus didn't know, couldn't know, the poisonous irony embedded in those words. Margaret and David Chen, eternal 8 and 5 years old, frozen in time at the moment his Honda Civic had torn through their family's sedan like a missile launched from his own cowardice and desperation. Marcus meant well, offering encouragement about returning to competition, but every word felt like salt ground into an open wound. The building's heating system kicked on with a mechanical wheeze, stirring papers on Mrs. Chen's distant desk and rustling the motivational posters she'd hung around the pool area. Never give up, proclaimed one, featuring a sunset over calm water. Champions are made in the deep end, insisted another, its bold letters fading but still legible in the dim emergency lighting. Michael found himself walking toward the starting blocks without conscious decision, his feet carrying him along the familiar path he'd traced in nightmares for 2 decades. Each step echoed in the vaulted space, a lonely percussion that seemed to count down the hours until his world collapsed entirely. The pool deck felt different beneath his shoes, not the comfortable territory of a janitor completing his rounds, but the sacred ground of a temple he'd been exiled from through his own failures. Standing at lane 4, the center lane reserved for the fastest qualifier, Michael closed his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to belong here. The phantom sensation of pool water against his skin, the explosive power of a perfect dive, the rhythmic meditation of stroke after stroke after stroke toward a finish line that represented everything pure and possible in the world. But the memories felt like artifacts from someone else's life, treasures buried too deep beneath 20 years of guilt and self-loathing to retrieve. When he opened his eyes, Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway. She wore the simple blue dress she favored for community events, her silver hair pulled back in the practical bun that had become her trademark during 15 years of managing the center. Her presence filled the space with warmth and purpose, transforming the sterile pool area into something that felt like home. But her expression carried an unfamiliar weight, a gravity that made Michael's stomach drop toward his shoes. "We need to talk," she said quietly. Michael's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Mrs. Chen stepped into the pool area with careful deliberation, her sensible shoes making soft whispers against the wet tile. The emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across her weathered face, revealing lines of exhaustion he'd never noticed during their gentle morning conversations. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by whatever burden had brought her here at 2 in the morning. "Mrs. Chen," he managed, his voice cracking like a teenager's, "you shouldn't be here this late. It's not safe." "Safe?" She moved closer, and Michael caught the scent of her familiar lavender perfume mixed with something else. Coffee gone cold, perhaps tears. "Michael, I've been sitting in my car for 30 minutes, watching those police officers leave. Watching you stand here like a man facing execution." Her dark eyes searched his face with uncomfortable intensity. What did they want? The lie formed automatically on his lips, 2 decades of practiced deflection, rising to shield him from exposure. Some story about routine security checks, about preparations for tomorrow's event, about anything except the truth that would destroy them both. But something in Mrs. Chen's expression stopped him cold, a resignation that suggested she already knew more than she was saying. "They wanted me to throw the race," he said finally, the words falling between them like stones into still water. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "And they had leverage to make you comply." It wasn't a question. She moved to one of the plastic chairs arranged for tomorrow's spectators, settling herself with the careful precision of someone whose bones ached more than she let on. "Sit with me, Michael, please." He remained frozen at the edge of lane 4, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to maintain the careful distance that had protected them both for so many years. But Mrs. Chen's voice carried a quiet authority that had guided him through countless small crises, and his body obeyed before his mind could object. The plastic chair creaked under his weight as he sat, maintaining careful space between them. The pool stretched before them like an accusation, its surface beginning to ripple slightly as the building's ventilation system stirred the air. Mrs. Chen stared at the water for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap with the same composure she brought to budget meetings and parent conferences. "You know," she said eventually, "when I first hired you, I thought you looked familiar. Not because of the swimming, though heaven knows your face was plastered across enough magazines in your day. Something else. Something that nagged at me for months." She turned to study his profile. "You have kind eyes, Michael, even when you're terrified. Even when you're carrying guilt that's eating you alive from the inside out, you have kind eyes." Michael's throat constricted. He could feel the confession building behind his ribs like water behind a cracking dam, 20 years of secrets demanding release. But the words wouldn't come, trapped by the certain knowledge that speaking would destroy the only person who'd shown him unconditional kindness since that terrible night in Phoenix. "I've been thinking about David a lot lately," Mrs. Chen continued, her voice growing soft. "He loved the water so much. From the time he could walk, he was drawn to it like a magnet." Margaret was more cautious. She inherited her grandmother's practical nature. But David, she smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. David believed he could breathe underwater if he tried hard enough. The dam cracked wider. Michael pressed his palms against his knees, fighting the tremor that threatened to shake him apart. He'd never allowed himself to think about the children as individuals, as personalities with dreams and fears and swimming lessons. Keeping them abstract, victims, rather than people, had been the only way to survive. The night they died, Mrs. Chen said, they were coming home from the community center pool. David had finally mastered the backstroke. He was so excited to show me, to demonstrate how he could float and kick at the same time. Margaret was planning to start lessons the next week. She'd been watching her little brother's progress with scientific interest, making notes in that serious way of hers. Michael's vision blurred. The pool before them began to fracture into kaleidoscope patterns, and he realized with distant horror that he was crying. Not the careful, controlled grief he'd allowed himself in private moments, but something raw and unstoppable that felt like bleeding out through his eyes. "I know, Michael," Mrs. Chen whispered, and her hand found his shoulder with infinite gentleness. "I've known for 3 years, and I've been waiting for you to trust me enough to tell me yourself." The confession died in his throat, replaced by something far more terrifying than guilt, the impossible, devastating possibility of forgiveness from the one person who had every right to destroy him. Michael's world tilted off its axis. The words he'd carried like stones in his chest for 20 years suddenly felt weightless, impossible. Mrs. Chen knew. She had known for 3 years, and yet she'd brought him coffee every morning, trusted him with her sanctuary, treated him like family. How? The word emerged as barely a whisper. Mrs. Chen's hand remained steady on his shoulder, an anchor in the storm of his disintegration. "A private investigator I hired found you 2 years ago, but I'd already started to suspect." Her voice carried no accusation, only a bone-deep weariness. "The way you flinched whenever the children's memorial plaque caught your eye. How you disappear every October 15th, their birthday. The fact that you were in Phoenix that night, competing in a qualifier you lost badly because you were drinking to numb some pain I couldn't understand." Michael doubled over, his breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the tile walls. The careful architecture of denial he'd constructed was collapsing, leaving him exposed and raw beneath the harsh pool lighting. "You should hate me," he choked out. "You should have called the police years ago." "Should I?" Mrs. Chen's voice remained maddeningly calm. "Tell me, Michael, what would that have accomplished? Would it bring David and Margaret back? Would it heal the hole their deaths tore in my soul?" She paused, studying the water that had been his former kingdom. Or would it simply destroy another life in service of vengeance that helps no one? The simplicity of her logic was devastating. Michael had spent 2 decades preparing for this moment, crafting elaborate justifications and desperate pleas, but he'd never considered the possibility of grace. It felt more terrifying than punishment, demanding something from him that he didn't know how to give. "The race tomorrow," he said, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "Those cops, they know about the accident. They'll expose everything if I don't lose." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. Officer Torres called me an hour ago. Very polite, very professional. Explained how unfortunate it would be if certain information became public right before our charity event. Her laugh held no humor. They underestimated how thoroughly I've researched my night janitor. Michael felt the last of his composure cracking. Then you know I can't win. I can't even get in that water without panic attacks. I haven't swum a real race in 20 years. I know. Mrs. Chen stood, moving to the pool's edge with surprising decisiveness. I also know those officers aren't just corrupt, they're part of something bigger. The city's redevelopment committee has been circling this property for months, waiting for us to fail so they can buy it for pennies and tear it down. Your victory tomorrow, if you could somehow manage it, would generate enough publicity and funding to keep us operating for years. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The charity race wasn't just about saving the community center. It was about exposing a conspiracy that reached far beyond 3 dirty cops with gambling debts. Michael's return to competition had become a threat to plans worth millions of dollars. They're going to destroy you either way, he said, the truth bitter on his tongue. If I win, they'll expose the accident to discredit the victory. If I lose, they'll still have the ammunition to use whenever it serves their purposes. Perhaps. Mrs. Chen turned back to him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he saw steel beneath her gentle exterior. But I've learned something important over these past 3 years, watching you work to redeem yourself in the only way you knew how. Redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about choosing to serve something larger than your own guilt. Michael stood on shaking legs, understanding finally what she was asking of him. Not confession, not apology, not even victory, but courage. The courage to step back into the water that had once been his salvation and was now his greatest fear. The courage to face 3 corrupt cops and their puppet masters. The courage to risk everything for people who deserved better than the broken world they'd inherited. I don't know if I can do it, he said. The water, it terrifies me now. And even if I could swim, I'm 39 years old. I haven't trained properly in decades. Mrs. Chen smiled, and in that expression, he saw echoes of the mother she'd been, the strength that had carried her through unimaginable loss. David used to tell me he could breathe underwater. I never had the heart to correct him. His faith seemed more important than my facts. She gestured toward the pool that stretched between them like a liquid battlefield. Maybe it's time to find out if he was right. Michael looked at the water, seeing not just 8 lanes of chlorinated terror, but something else. Possibility, redemption, the chance to finally honor the children whose deaths had haunted his dreams by saving the place that would honor their memory. There would be no going back from this moment. The comfortable anonymity of janitor Michael was about to die, replaced by something far more dangerous and infinitely more necessary. He began removing his shoes. The chlorinated air hit his skin like a physical shock as Michael rolled up his work pants and sat at the pool's edge. His bare feet touched the water, and every muscle in his body seized with remembered terror. The surface rippled outward from his toes, sending concentric circles across the lane lines like a liquid radar announcing his presence to every nightmare that lived in the deep end. Start slow, Mrs. Chen said, settling back into her chair. The water remembers you, even if you've forgotten how to trust it. Michael slid into the shallow end, the cool embrace rising to his waist, then his chest. His breathing turned shallow and rapid, each inhalation a conscious act of will. The pool felt both foreign and familiar, smaller than memory suggested but infinitely more dangerous. Every instinct screamed at him to climb out, to return to the safety of dry land and honest janitorial work. But Mrs. Chen's presence anchored him, her quiet faith more powerful than his fear. He managed 10 strokes before the panic hit. His technique was rust and muscle memory fighting each other, his shoulders burning from unaccustomed effort. But worse than physical weakness was the mental ambush. Halfway down the lane, the water transformed into that rain-slicked Phoenix Street, the blue tiles becoming twisted metal and broken glass. He stopped swimming, gulping air like a drowning man despite being in 4 feet of water. Again, Mrs. Chen called softly. The children used to practice here every Tuesday. David always insisted on lane 4, said it was the fastest. Michael forced himself back to the starting wall. each return trip to the shallow end a small victory against the terror that threatened to overwhelm him. By his 5th attempt, he made it 30 strokes before stopping. By his 10th, he was remembering fragments of technique, the catch phase of his stroke, the rhythm of bilateral breathing, the way water became an ally instead of an enemy when approached with respect rather than force. The locker room door burst open with a metallic crash that echoed through the pool area like a gunshot. Well, well, Officer Morrison stepped into the aquatic center, flanked by Torres and Williams. Look what we have here, a midnight swimming lesson. Michael's blood turned to ice, but he forced himself to remain in the water. Standing would feel like surrender, like acknowledging their authority over this space that had become sacred ground. Mrs. Chen rose from her chair with deliberate calm, positioning herself between the officers and the pool. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years managing difficult teenagers and demanding parents. "The facility is closed, unless this is an emergency." "Oh, it's an emergency, all right," Morrison interrupted, his grin sharp as broken glass. "Our friend here seems to be suffering from selective amnesia about our earlier conversation." Williams circled toward the far end of the pool, cutting off Michael's escape route. The choreography felt practiced, predatory. These men had done this before, cornered people in spaces where they felt safe, violated sanctuaries to make their point about who really held power. "You know what I find interesting?" Torres pulled out his phone, thumbs moving across the screen with casual menace. "I've got the Phoenix Police Department on speed dial. Detective Martinez owes me a favor from way back. He'd be very interested to know that Michael Donovan, wanted for vehicular manslaughter, has been hiding in Baltimore for 20 years. Michael's grip tightened on the pool's edge, his knuckles white against the coping. The water that had felt like possibility moments before now felt like a trap, limiting his mobility while his tormentors controlled the deck. "There's just one problem with your threat," Mrs. Chen said, her voice cutting through their swagger like a blade. "I've already contacted Detective Martinez." The silence that followed felt electric, charged with shifting power dynamics and crumbling assumptions. Morrison's grin faltered. Torres stopped scrolling, and Williams actually took a step backward. 3 hours ago, to be precise," Mrs. Chen continued, pulling her own phone from her dress pocket. "Had a lovely conversation about the statute of limitations, police jurisdiction, and the difference between justice and vengeance. Would you like to hear the recording?" Michael watched his tormentors' faces cycle through confusion, anger, and something approaching fear. These were men accustomed to holding all the cards, to controlling narratives through intimidation and superior firepower. Mrs. Chen's calm revelation that she'd been 3 moves ahead shattered their confidence like thin ice. "You're bluffing," Morrison said, but uncertainty poisoned his voice. Mrs. Chen's smile held no warmth. "Michael, would you like to tell them about our other ally, the one who's been investigating the redevelopment committee's finances for the past 6 months?" Michael pulled himself from the water, standing dripping on the deck with newfound purpose. The fear was still there, would always be there, but it no longer paralyzed him. Mrs. Chen had transformed this confrontation from his personal judgment into something larger, a battle for the community center's survival. "Her name's Detective Sarah Kim," he said, watching realization dawn on their faces. "Internal affairs. She's very interested in cops who bet against charity races." The 3 officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about fractured trust and unraveling schemes. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, a gesture born of desperation rather than tactical advantage. Williams backed closer to the exit, his earlier bravado evaporating like chlorine in the ventilation system. "Internal affairs." Torres's voice cracked slightly. "You can't prove we placed any bets." Mrs. Chen's laugh held the gentle cruelty of a teacher who'd caught students cheating on their final exam. "Oh, my dear boy. Detective Kim has been recording conversations for months, something about unusual patterns in police betting circles, money flowing through offshore accounts, remarkable coincidences between redevelopment committee meetings and certain officers' gambling activities." Michael felt the balance of power shifting beneath their feet, like tectonic plates realigning. These men who'd controlled him through fear and blackmail were suddenly the ones looking for escape routes, calculating odds that no longer favored them. The charity race was never just about the community center, Mrs. Chen continued, moving closer to the pool where Michael stood dripping. It was about flushing out the entire network. Your approach to Michael was the confirmation Detective Kim needed that the corruption reached into our neighborhood, into our sanctuary. Morrison's composure cracked completely. You set us up. This whole thing, it's entrapment. Is it? Mrs. Chen tilted her head with false innocence. Or did you simply reveal your true nature when you thought no one was watching? Michael's return to swimming wasn't planned. It was genuine courage overcoming genuine fear. Your response to that courage, however, was entirely predictable. Michael watched Williams edge toward the door, cellular phone already in his hand. The officer's face had gone pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting, sweat beading on his forehead despite the pool area's cool temperature. He was calculating distances, escape routes, ways to minimize damage to himself regardless of what happened to his partners. Don't even think about it, a new voice cut through the tension. Detective Sarah Kim stepped through the entrance Williams had been approaching, her badge visible on her belt, her posture radiating professional authority that made the three corrupt officers look like children playing dress-up. Gentlemen, I believe we have several matters to discuss. Torres made a sound like a deflating balloon. Morrison's hand fell away from his weapon as if it had burned him. Williams simply stood frozen, his phone clutched in white knuckles while his carefully constructed world collapsed around him. Detective Kim was younger than Michael had expected, perhaps mid-30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and the compact build of someone who'd earned her rank through competence rather than politics. She surveyed the scene with professional detachment, taking note of Michael's position by the pool, Mrs. Chen's protective stance, the three officers' varying degrees of panic. The redevelopment committee's money laundering operation is quite sophisticated, Kim said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Millions of dollars flowing through construction contracts that exist only on paper, campaign contributions from shell companies, property acquisitions funded by gambling profits. Very impressive, really. Michael felt something loosening in his chest. Not relief exactly, but a recognition that the confrontation had moved beyond his personal guilt into larger questions of justice and community protection. The race tomorrow would still matter, but not as a vehicle for his own redemption. It had become something more important, a symbol of resistance against forces that would destroy spaces where healing could happen. Detective Kim, Mrs. Chen said formally, I believe these officers were attempting to coerce race results for financial gain. Michael has agreed to cooperate fully with your investigation. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Cooperation meant exposure, meant admitting publicly to crimes he'd hidden for 20 years. But as he looked at Mrs. Chen's face, seeing not judgment but something approaching pride, he understood that hiding was no longer an option. The Phoenix incident, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I'm ready to make a full statement. Detective Kim nodded, her expression softening slightly. Detective Martinez briefed me on your case. The statute of limitations expired years ago, Mr. Donovan. You can't be prosecuted for the accident itself. But your testimony about these officers' blackmail attempts, that's very much within current jurisdiction. Morrison made a desperate last attempt at control. You can't believe these people. Phelps is a has-been drunk who killed 2 kids and ran. The old lady's protecting him because she's gone senile. Mrs. Chen's smile became positively dangerous. Detective Kim, would you like to see the recording of Officer Morrison threatening to manufacture evidence if Michael didn't comply with their demands? The audio quality is quite clear. The pool area fell silent except for the gentle lapping of water against the lane lines. Michael realized his fear had transformed into something else entirely. Not courage exactly, but purpose. Tomorrow's race would happen, regardless of the outcome with these 3 officers. And win or lose, he would finally stop running from the man he'd been and start becoming the person. These children, David and Margaret Chen, and all the others who use this pool as sanctuary, deserve to have protecting their memory. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place echoed through the pool area like a death knell for everything Michael had built over the past 20 years. Detective Kim moved with practiced efficiency, reading Morrison his rights, while Williams slumped against the wall in defeated silence. Torres kept muttering about lawyers and false accusations, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man who knew his carefully constructed world had just collapsed. The recording device was installed last Tuesday, Mrs. Chen explained to Detective Kim, gesturing toward a barely visible sensor near the pool's timing system. After the first approach to Michael, I thought it prudent to document any subsequent conversations. Michael watched his tormentors being processed, but instead of relief, he felt a strange emptiness opening in his chest. These men had given him something to fight against, a concrete enemy to focus on instead of the shapeless guilt that had haunted him for decades. Now, with their threat neutralized, he was left facing the deeper terror that had been lurking beneath the surface, tomorrow's race itself. "The investigation will continue," Detective Kim said, securing Morrison's hands behind his back. "The redevelopment committee has tentacles throughout city government, but your willingness to testify, Mr. Donovan, gives us the leverage we need to unravel the entire network." The words should have brought comfort, but Michael found himself staring at the pool's surface, watching the overhead lights create shifting patterns on the water. 8 lanes stretched before him like liquid judgment, each one a reminder of the swimmer he'd once been and the man he'd become. The corrupt officers had been external obstacles, but the race tomorrow would force him to confront something far more dangerous: the possibility of failure in front of everyone who'd believed in his redemption. "I need to ask," Detective Kim said, approaching him as the last officer was escorted out, "are you actually planning to compete tomorrow? Because if this is some elaborate performance to flush out corruption, we can—" Michael's voice surprised him with its firmness. "The race is real. My participation is real. Whether I can actually complete it—" He gestured helplessly at the water. "That remains to be seen." Mrs. Chen moved to stand beside him, her presence an anchor of calm in the churning uncertainty. "Detective Kim, how many people know about tonight's arrests?" The operation was contained. My team, a few federal investigators working the money laundering angle. We can keep this quiet until after the race if needed. Michael understood what she was offering: the chance to compete without the media circus that would inevitably follow once news of the corruption investigation broke. A final opportunity to face the water on his own terms, without the distraction of reporters asking about dirty cops and redevelopment schemes. But as he contemplated tomorrow's ordeal, the magnitude of what he'd agreed to attempt settled over him like a weight. 20 years of fear and guilt had rewired his nervous system, turning water from salvation into terror. His body had forgotten the rhythms of competitive swimming. His mind had learned to associate pools with panic rather than performance. The children who would be watching, David Chen's friends, the community members who'd invested their hope in this charity event, deserved better than a broken man's desperate attempt at redemption. "I should withdraw," he said quietly. "Find another swimmer, someone who can actually represent the community center properly. These people don't need to watch me fail in front of everyone." Mrs. Chen's hand found his shoulder, her grip surprisingly strong. "Michael, do you know what David used to say about the water?" He shook his head, not trusting his voice. He said it remembered everything. Every swimmer who'd ever trained in it, every race that had been won or lost, every moment of joy and fear and triumph. He believed the pool held all of that energy, waiting to give it back to anyone brave enough to ask. Michael looked down at his hands, still trembling slightly from the confrontation with the officers. These hands had once pulled him through water faster than almost anyone alive. They'd also gripped a steering wheel on a rain-soaked Phoenix night, failing to stop in time to prevent a tragedy that had redefined his existence. "What if I'm not brave enough?" he whispered. "What if I get in that water tomorrow and the panic takes over? What if I shame their memory instead of honoring it?" Detective Kim finished gathering her evidence and approached them one final time. "Mr. Donovan, I've spent 6 months investigating the corruption that's been poisoning this community. These people," she gestured around the pool area, "they need to see that regular citizens can still fight back, still choose courage over convenience. Your race tomorrow isn't just about swimming, it's about proving that redemption is possible, that people can change." As the detective left, Michael found himself alone with Mrs. Chen and 8 lanes of water that held 20 years of accumulated fear. Tomorrow would bring the greatest test of his life, not just physical, but spiritual. Everything he'd learned about courage, about service, about the difference between hiding from guilt and transforming it into purpose would be distilled into a single race. The ordeal was beginning. The morning of the race arrived gray and merciless, October rain drumming against the aquatic center's windows like accusations Michael couldn't escape. He'd barely slept, spending the pre-dawn hours staring at his ceiling while phantom water filled his lungs with every attempted breath. Now, standing in the locker room where this nightmare had begun, he felt the familiar claws of panic tearing at his chest. His hands shook as he pulled on the borrowed racing suit, a sleek blue second skin that felt like a costume for a role he could no longer play. 20 years ago, this ritual had been sacred, the careful preparation, the mental rehearsal of race strategy, the building anticipation of speed made manifest in water. Now it felt like preparing for his own execution. Through the locker room walls he could hear the crowd gathering. Voices multiplied into an expectant murmur, punctuated by children's laughter and the squeak of bleachers filling with bodies. Mrs. Chen had mentioned 300 expected attendees, but it sounded like half of Baltimore had shown up to witness either his redemption or his spectacular failure. Michael caught his reflection in the metal mirror above the sink and barely recognized the man staring back. The racing suit couldn't hide what 20 years of running had done to his body, the soft edges where muscle had once been carved from obsession and excellence, the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed nerves stretched past their breaking point. This wasn't Michael Phelps preparing for Olympic glory. This was Michael Donovan, night janitor and coward, about to humiliate himself in front of everyone who'd believed Mrs. Chen's impossible dream. "Focus," he whispered to his reflection. "One length. Just survive one length." But even as he spoke the words, his mind conjured the image of the starting blocks, the 8 lanes stretching endlessly before him, the moment when he would have to launch himself into water that had become his enemy. His breathing quickened, the familiar spiral beginning, shallow pants that brought no oxygen, the sense of walls closing in, the certainty that he was about to die. A knock at the door shattered his spiraling thoughts. 5 minutes, Mr. Donovan. 5 minutes, 300 seconds, until he would have to walk onto that deck, climb onto the starting block, and face the accumulated terror of 20 years. Michael gripped the sink's edge, his knuckles white against the porcelain, and tried to remember Mrs. Chen's words about courage. But courage felt like a foreign concept now, something that belonged to a different man in a different life. He forced himself toward the door, each step a monumental effort of will. The hallway leading to the pool deck stretched before him like a gauntlet, fluorescent lights humming overhead with mechanical indifference. From beyond the double doors, he could hear the race announcer testing the microphone, the sound system crackling to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Riverside Community Center Charity Swim Meet." Michael pushed through the doors and immediately understood the magnitude of his mistake. The pool area had been transformed into something resembling an actual competition venue. Timing equipment installed, lane ropes stretched taut, bleachers packed with faces that turned toward him with expressions ranging from curious excitement to barely concealed skepticism. Local news cameras occupied one corner, their red recording lights already active. The water itself looked different under the bright competition lighting, not the forgiving blue sanctuary where he'd attempted his midnight rehabilitation, but a stark, unforgiving arena where weakness would be exposed and broadcast. 8 lanes of judgment, each one a liquid courtroom where his 20-year sentence would finally be pronounced. Mrs. Chen appeared at his side, her hand finding his elbow as his legs threatened to buckle. "Michael, you don't look well. Perhaps—" "I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crowd noise. "I thought I could, but standing here seeing all these people, I can't do this to them. I can't let them watch me fail." The other swimmers were already on deck, stretching and preparing with the casual confidence of athletes who belonged in this environment. They looked impossibly young, impossibly capable, their bodies moving with the fluid economy of motion that he'd once possessed but lost somewhere between Phoenix and Baltimore. Against them, he wasn't a competitor. He was an imposter about to be exposed. "The corruption investigation doesn't need this," he continued, backing away from the pool's edge. "You have your evidence. The officers are arrested. The community center is saved. Let these real swimmers handle the race. I'll watch from the stands, support the cause without embarrassing everyone." But even as he spoke the words, Michael felt something dying inside him. Not just the possibility of redemption, but the fragile hope that Mrs. Chen and David's memory had somehow planted in the wasteland of his guilt. He was choosing safety over courage, hiding over healing, proving that 20 years of running had made cowardice his most fundamental truth. The starting whistle was minutes away, and Michael Donovan was already drowning.